Hello and good evening. I'm Jonathan Albin. I am Game Master Jay, and I am here with NycosRPG and the Game Master Soapbox. Our format is adjusting a little bit to player interests and things that have been recommended to me. And today we're going to be talking about how you can embark into the unforgettable with the NycosRPG system. So we're going to be talking specifically about how the system works, how it can help your game, and how it can expand what you are hoping to achieve in your roleplay experiences. We are going to be talking in particular about how we can unleash the adventures regardless of the game systems that you're operating under, because the system, the NycosRPG system, is not intended to necessarily replace but to amplify your play experience. Next, we're going to talk about the nature of world building under the NycosRPG mechanism. We're going to discuss the development of character creation and the expansion of character interests within the game. We're also going to talk about the unbridled and interactive storytelling that can be accomplished utilizing this mechanism, and how it increases the relaxed collaborative nature of gameplay within the groups. Additionally, we're going to be providing at the end an option or a means by which you can get a free copy of the Dark Shard system book and start to apply the NycosRPG mechanism in your own home games. So before we get started, I wanted to thank you for your viewership. And if you like what you see, make sure you click on the follow button down below. Like us on Facebook, add us in terms of your share mechanisms, and by all means subscribe to our channel, because that's how we can definitely get the word out to more people. If you don't like what you see, I appreciate what time you've offered us so far, and I wish you Godspeed. Now, when I talk about unleashing an RPG system or to unleash your adventures, what I'm speaking of is a mechanism whereby you, as the game master and storyteller, can amplify your players' joy in the game by allowing for enhanced or increased effectiveness, game over game, session over session, without your needing to provide them with a specific pile of experience points. They simply can amplify their abilities using NycosRPG. It also provides a mechanism for taking care of die rolling in a completely innovative way, and that will also release you from having to cross-check statistics all the time or cross-check damage values and so on. Finally, within that, we're also talking about unleashing your ability as a storyteller from needing to worry about the CR ratings per se of each individual creature monster that you bring to bear on your players, and gives you a more smooth transition during competitions, whether they be skills checks or whether they be skill versus skill conflicts, or even going all the way to combat. So as you go along, you'll see that the NycosRPG mechanism fundamentally acts as a saddle system. It can be used standalone, or it can be used with other systems to make your players familiar first, and then bring them to an understanding of how this system can really help them overall. Now, when I say that it involves an intuitive, accelerated world building, what do I mean? Well, a storyteller, a game master who is spending all of his time building his world, has to take into account just a boatload of information on the nature and the abilities and the weapons and the gear and on for their nemesis characters, for the villains. And this can often take a huge amount of your creative time and drag you down into the depths of slogging through a rule system to look for particular abilities and skills. I know that in my case as a game master, for decades, when I built a new adventure, I would take hours and hours to build out not just the physical map of the location, but I had to worry about the biospheres and which creatures ate which creatures and all of that. And that's all great. That's all really, really important to do. But if you're busy pursuing looking in the monster manual for the the skill, the abilities and attributes of the monsters, or going to an alternate source to get additional creatures and things to bring to the table to make it interesting to your players, all of this research tends to drag you down into the pit of rules and bogs down your creativity, bogs down the player's interaction, when you can actually supplant and improve that by adapting a mechanism that allows a more relative approach. I go far more into information on this in my how to play presentations, which I'm doing on Saturday mornings. So if you want to know more about that, you can check with me on startplaying.games and find the Nycos How to Play events. Anyway, this opening up of the creativity means that you can spend more time working on the biosphere. You can spend more time worrying about what the creature's life cycle is. You can do all kinds of nuanced things that make the game at once faster to develop and also more intuitive, because the entire NycosRPG mechanism is based on a statistics system. So fundamentally, there's a way to scale what you are doing within your creature base to determine its effectiveness against your opponents by knowing where your players are and what their potentials are, and therefore matching more quickly and intuitively, simply doing a short equation. Just, is this equal to that? Yes. Okay, we're good to go. If this isn't equal to that, then I have to increase X by this. It's simple. But the point is that it's intuitive. It's easy to comprehend. A 15% is a 15%. If it's something is likely to happen at a 60 to 65%, then it's that number. It's easy to determine. So world building made easier makes the job for a game master easier. Well, what about the characters? Well, a character development that allows for consistent, constant, and creative character development puts back into the hands of the players the ability to make the game their own. And making the game their own means that you are doing your job as a storyteller and game master to bring them into the universe that you are presenting. This constant character advancement mechanism actually eventually it makes the CR system irrelevant, because you don't have to worry about how many experience points the players earned in an encounter. They simply advance by the things that they do in game. What this allows also for is that the players then can create their own pathway through the game, so that the restrictions that are involved with building a traditional character in a traditional roleplay game fall away. You don't have to worry about a class, because any being can take any pathway to its own enlightenment, whether that be through mystical means, or whether that's through physical means, or whether that's through skill-based. It just opens it up so much. Furthermore, you don't have to establish, if you're using a system that includes a pool of hit points, you can certainly maintain using that if you want. On the other hand, this system actually establishes a different relationship between life essence and movement activity and such in the environment, and removes all of those burdens, and instead provides you with a very solid mechanism for choosing direction for characters as they move forward, because what they choose to do is what they do. If they choose to follow a path that leads them down a martial course, then everything that they're doing that is martial is going to advance it. If they have chosen instead to pick up new mystical abilities, then we simply follow that course. So each of these methodologies means that a character can be a broad brush of who a person really is, not limiting them to a restricted pathway or course through their life as a character. So these changes provide for a more constant and creative character development. Well, let's talk a little bit about how does the integration work? How does a player and a DM interconnect? And it's simple. They're unbridled. They're no longer limited. The players can choose the direction they want to go within the story, and the game master can intrinsically follow them because he's presenting his story or his series of encounters such that the players then can choose their own means of resolving them. Does it mean that you always fight? No. Does it mean that you never fight? No. It means that you have the opportunity to do exactly what you want within the game environment. And it's interactive in that the players have as much input into what the actions are within the game in terms of their dedication, and then the dedication and the action that they take resolves by a simple comparison, and you can handle it in moments rather than hours and hours of a combat slog. And I know how many of us dislike the combat slog of certain game systems. This gets rid of that and replaces it with a quicker, more theatric, and more cinematic experience for the players and the storyteller. Finally, it's a more relaxed, collaborative gameplay mechanism because the very concepts that made the player have to pigeonhole or arrange his life to fit the direction that the storyteller wanted to go is much more open. It's connective. You're building a world in which these persona exist. It's a place. It's a thought process that moves people from the tune-based game mechanism into a personality-based role-play system. And that change over is not only revolutionary, but it's liberating. It's so much, there's so much liberty and freedom in it, I can't even describe it. And I know that I'm going through this way faster than I expected to because I'm just so excited about it. But I want to get to the last part now that we're here already. I want to maintain this, that if you want to get your hands on a free copy of the PDF of the Nykos Dark Shards system book, which is the first of the books that will be that's being produced. If you want to receive the early release PDF version of it, simply show up Saturday morning on this channel, NycosRPG, at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we are going to be hosting an event through startplaying.games. If you haven't been to that site, it's amazing. It's a way you can actually find game masters that run the games that you like in a wide variety of time slots. And while it is admittedly for play endeavor, there are many events such as my introduction to Nykos event there is no charge for, and you simply go there and you can register for the event in advance so that you got a slot guaranteed. Now, I only have a limited number of them. I only have eight slots for the Saturday morning event, and so it's the only one I currently have scheduled. So make sure you get over there and subscribe as quickly as you can for that, so that you can get your copy of the Dark Shards PDF, the Dark Shards system book PDF. That gives you everything you need to be able to administer or play in a NycosRPG roleplay game that utilizes the mechanism. So also, for more information on the system itself, you can check my playlists. Many of my episodes have snippets and pieces about the NycosRPG, and so it'll say so in the description or in the title. But make sure you get it. If you get a chance, you need to check those things out. And specifically, go to startplaying.com, www.startplaying.games. I said that wrong. Startplaying.games. And look up Jonathan G. Albin as Game Master. You'll see my event and register for the Saturday morning event, 10 a.m. And that registration should be up later tonight. So do that. I want to thank you for being here for this short Game Master Soapbox edition. I want to tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. If you like what you see, make sure you like and press like on the video. And if you're not already, subscribe to the channel and Yes, that's very funny. That is very funny, Sephiroth. That is awesome. That is awesome. There is upcoming for the Nycos RPG in particular. There's something that might be of interest to you, and that is there's one of the system books is going to be Driftwood Saloon, and that will have the option to go with all the Wild West accoutrement, and it'll have information on the types of occupations that were done in the period, the kinds of skills you might develop in those frameworks. And as far as the concept of hamsters, that's very clever. That's very clever. As a matter of fact, since you mentioned that they're space hamsters, you could also look at the possibility of utilizing the Distant Suns system book, which is also coming down the pipe. Now, all of these games that we're talking about are also available through the startplaying.games website. You can simply request a game in those genres, and I will create an event and we'll host it. So, yeah, exactly. Oh, give me a second. I want to show you something. I have a model for just that thing. Just a second. You're not gonna believe this. Yeah, I've actually found this model at a game store, and I bought it and had it painted. So I don't know how well it's going to show up on the screen here. But granted, it is actually a bear. But you can imagine it as a giant hamster. And the person riding it is a very charming little dwarf. Let's see. All decked out and got her sword out there and everything. So that is very, very concept. That's very, very clever concept. In the fantasy world of Nykos, I have a group of beings that are known as the Quumpel, and the Quumpel are basically gnomes that live in the deserts, and they ride on battle alpaca or battle paca. And so the idea of brown bear-sized hamsters, that sounds awesome. Watch out for the amount of grain they'll eat. They pound for pound, they put away a lot more than a horse does. So that may be a plus or a minus. So just realize that the NycosRPG mechanism allows you to play multi-genres. The full panoply of the system includes 6 different books covering the six overarching genres. So science fiction, superheroes, ancient mysteries, modern detective, things like that. Oh, that is wild. Yeah. You only got an ad. Yeah, that's true. That's true. I get too thrilled with it. But the point of this video was to make sure we talk about how the system can improve your game sessions, whatever mechanism you're playing. And Sephiroth, I do recommend that if you can, get over to the startplaying.games site and sign up for the upcoming How to Play a seminar that I'm doing on NycosRPG on startplaying.games about the NycosRPG. So if there's anything else that I can help you with, make sure to send me a direct message if you want to. Leave a comment down below. As I said, this video will be going up onto YouTube in about half an hour or so, about the same time as the event is updated in startplaying.games, because I want to make sure that's all accessible. But I know this has been a short show, so if you don't mind, I don't mind sticking around and answering questions or talking about whatever you want. Ask me anything, kind of kicks in at this point, because I've covered what I wanted to cover. I was so excited, but I was afraid that I was going to forget something and not get it all covered. So now that I've done that, I'm good to go for what this episode needed to be on my part. Now I know that it's not role-playing games are a matter of the players as well as the game master. Now, Sephiroth, are you the game master, or is this going to be something that you would be playing in. It looks like you'd be doing it as a Old West game that you'd be running. I love the Wild West. I was born in Kansas. Oh, there you go. Sephiroth, you and me are in the same boat. I started game mastering in 1975 or so, and I never stopped. And I did stop playing at some point along the line, only because I'd gotten to the point as storyteller where I got to the point where I was actually predicting, would you say, just discovering what the game master was trying to do before he got there, and either working away from it or whatever. And it just was not. It wasn't fun for the players, and if I downplayed that, then I was either playing a imbecile or a character that had no input to the story, and that wasn't fun for me either. So yes, I learned how to play. Yeah, no, I started game mastering because Dave Arneson was my buddy's grandpa Dave. So I learned from one of the two guys that designed the game. And there have been some conversations about when I learned how to play, because I was 11 when I learned, but I don't remember whether it was spring or fall. It was either 1974, which would have been pre-release, and that's possible because Dave didn't have any printed materials. He only had handwritten and typed materials. And then it could have been as late as the spring of 75, which would have made it after the publication started. So, and I get you. If you've been a forever game master since 2020, you got started right about the time COVID hit. So I applaud you for that. That's a tough place to start, because during COVID, when COVID hit, I was actually doing live streaming of my games groups at a game store, and we literally were there one day, and the next day they closed the store down. So yes, it did. It definitely assisted in the D&D boom. I think that there are a wide number of factors that helped with that. You could point to Stranger Things, because that representation in the show, that representation in that very first episode was the best representation of D&D on a TV show. Until you go way back, you may not remember, may not even know this, but in the movie E.T., they're playing a role-playing game at the very beginning of that show, and that was the last time there was a good representation. Granted, we've got Big Bang Theory, we've got Community, and several other TV shows that have danced along the edge of it, or mentioned it, or even brought out versions of it. This is all, of course, well in advance of Matt Mercer and Critical Role, but the earlier versions, and you're going to go all the way back, go back to Mazes and Monsters, the movie with Tom Hanks, really got it wrong and really did a hatchet job, if you will, on the hobby back in those days. But yes, Discord was I discovered Discord during the period of creating all of this, and so my Discord channel is about as old as that is as well. But the COVID, when it struck and I wasn't able to get out of the house to do the stores, I actually, Orcus is a big baddie, that's for sure. Wow, yeah, that's he's a tough SOB, that's for sure. I played a campaign where I ran a campaign rather, where the players were attempting to seek the wand of Orcus and the flail of Demogorgon and something else. I think it was the crown of Asmodeus, but they were going for 3 major big baddies trying to quench a gateway to the negative planes. It was wild. So yeah, I get that. Yep, you're exactly right. Now during COVID, I was running 9 campaigns, if you can imagine, every week, and they were contemporaneous. so they were playing in the same time frame, and they were in certain cases crossing over. So we had crossover episodes online because of COVID, but we had groups of 8 and 10 and 12 characters engaged in role play online. Yes, I would agree. His fortification is probably the best because it's also the most centralized, and therefore it has to be. Plus, if you're talking about the demons, if this is pre-Blood War, yeah, he had to worry about even his own brethren coming after him. After the Blood War starts, of course, there's more syncopation between the demonic force, the demonic forces against the devilish forces. Yep, exactly. Yeah, we had in the campaign I was speaking of with our interaction with Orcus, our cleric was actually in the habit of raising dead soldiers and giving them a second chance in life to fight against the darkness, and he was completely deflated his first engagement with Orcus because all of his forces just turned around and came back at us. So yeah, it's a mess. Exactly. But where I was going with that statement is that the problems that come up when you have a really large group of players, especially when you're running 2 sessions conjunctively, they all have different agendas, they all have different focuses, and trying to make sure that you're able to feed into each player during that period of time became challenging. As a matter of fact, in one of my sessions, I have a young lady that plays in our group, and I say young lady, she's 78 years old, and when she plays, she was actually playing in multiple campaigns, so she would literally set up a second chair, and she would actually get up and move from one chair to the other to play the various characters in the conjoined game group, so that she would make sure to remember which character sheet she was looking at and stuff. Yeah, Orcus was definitely I guess for me that would have been in the 76, 77, 78 time frame that the concept of entering the demonic planes and going to battle was critical. That was also the period of the beginning of what's known as the Satanic Panic. You may not be in remembrance of that or aware of it, but in that period of time, many faithful Christian people felt that Dungeons and Dragons was by its nature intrinsically evil and would deny their own kids the ability to play it, and actively went into game stores and schools and tried to shut it down. And during that period, I actually became an apologist. I would go from congregation to congregation, from game store to game store, to speak to the parents who were concerned, because as a young 13, 14, 15-year-old game master, I was in the thick of it, but I was also myself a Christian, and so therefore I was in a position to negotiate or to discuss, and it made for some fun, challenging conversations, but it made it a challenge to be a game master and deal with the evils of the world. And so naturally creating a campaign where you actually march into the demonic places and go after, literally going into hell and going after the 7 deadly sins, or if you're going to go into the abyss and go after the biblical, if you will, demonic forces like Legion and such. It made for great role play experiences and also teaching moments. So it was a great way to play. I totally get what you're saying about Orcus's stat block. He is insane. It's a slog. The direction of games, I think, fortunately have moved away from that, but in a skewed kind of way, because they also, in getting rid of the inherently evil nature of the demon forces and the devilish forces, and making the alignment more of a sliding scale than a clear and defined good versus evil line, I think they are doing a disservice for all of us in terms of the validity of role playing as a mechanism. Well, that's possibly true, and it wasn't until the last 2 or 3 years that I actually got myself a hooded cowl. I picked up a costume at one of the shops in Hollywood that's a legitimate broadcloth cassock. Got the whole bit. But before that, yeah, the idea of somebody wearing a hood in their basement was just downright silly. And it didn't happen. It was that stereotype. There were people that had their magician costume from the previous year, so they had the sparkly purple hats with the stars and stuff. But they were ridiculous, and they were costume, and they were just goofy. And there was no gravitas to it that was put into the movies. By the way, if you haven't seen it, there is a great movie that came out, and it was published by. It actually got the approval of Chick Publications to publish the movie version of Darkest Dungeon, Deepest Dungeon. I have a copy of the movie. That's cool. That's cool. That's a great question. Devil or demon? Which do I like better? That's funny. Oh, that's hysterical. No, which do I use more often? Well, I don't use either. Fortunately, the game world that I operate through, the system that Nykos is built on, is a game world that was isolated 3 iterations ago. So 3 games groups worth of play. So 18 years ago, the games group figured a way to move the world to a safe place to prevent outer planar, inner planar interactions. So my players don't have to face that. They do have to deal with their own, no pun intended, inner demons. There are creatures known as Daemon that are the enemy, and they are just as devastating, but they are specific to the world of Nykos itself because it's not within the pantheon of the known deities and gods and such. So if you ask me which I prefer, if we're playing a completely different game, if we're playing 40K, I am a Khorne 40K Mark of Khorne player. I play Chaos Forces, Berserkers, and the like. But I also play Orcs, so that says a lot too there. So, yes, the issue of the balancing act between devils and demons, of course, is the argument that they are built upon a specific hard line, again, between law and chaos. And the challenge is that the variation between law and chaos is itself just as blurry as the line between good and evil. And so when you blur those lines, they're not as difficult. They're more difficult to tell apart. For example, knowing the difference between a pit fiend, which is a devil, and a Balrog, which is a demon, is difficult to make out when you look at them as far as their stats, their attributes, even their fighting styles. They're fundamentally the same. So devils arguably are more fun to play with from the standpoint of players actually interacting with them, because generally when you see a demonic force, it's already showing itself to be demonic, and so all you do is brutally attack it because it's going to only fight. That's all it's going to do. So the lawful side of it's arguably more fun to play with. You can do bartering, dealing with the devils and things like that. But even that, to me, is a sidelight, because the concept of darkness and evil being a thing is more important than whether or not you're on this side of the line or not. So I definitely appreciate your position on Orcus being a very big bad in the demonic world. I would have you take a look at the information that's in the Blood Wars saga. There's a lot of Blood Wars stories in there that. Oh yeah, oh yeah. That's a. Sapphiros talk about in a campaign they had a devil who got a PC to trade a memory for 60 platinum. That's because none of us understand and appreciate the value of memory. That's one of the reasons why the role-playing mechanism as a whole is so important, because as a role player, we are going to build our creativity, we're going to build our imagination, we're going to build our memory, we're going to build our experiential boost area. There have been study after study that have proven that an activity that occurs in the imagination becomes tangible with repetition, so that when we talk about what happened with our 15th level character, or when we talk about the attack on the fortress of Orcus, when we build these positions into our minds with our other players, we build memory, we build creativity, and we also grab anchors, if you will, that improve our own mental acuity on other subjects. A very good friend of mine by the name of Dr. Chrissy Mackey has a doctorate degree based on a thesis wherein she argues that playing the game Dungeons and Dragons is a positive educational mechanism for adult beings, not just kids. And she actually presented that doctoral thesis about a year ago or 2 years ago, and she got her doctorate approved, and she is now officially a PhD in games. So, oh, that's nice. That sounds appropriate. That's very funny. Swapping out one good memory for an evil memory and throwing in 60 platinums. Maybe the trader, the person who traded it, got a deal. And nice. Yeah, Oni are also bad news. They're a completely different ball of wax, because the yin yang angles and the graduation of good versus evil within the individual has to be measured even at the Oni level. So it gets wild and crazy there too. So I totally am following you there on that, Sephiroth. The gist of where I was going with this all is that role play, as it is valuable and as it is important to individuals, it is actually as important to humanity that we reinstate the very concepts of creativity that we have somewhat pushed aside. As you probably had in your experience, I had in mine, which is once you reach adulthood, once you reach that, whatever that critical age is, maybe it was 16 for you, maybe it was 20, maybe it was 24, but at some point, your relatives and friends would look at you as a role player and say, you should grow up. You should, get a real occupation, real hobby, and get out of this. And I'm one of the few who can honestly say that for almost 50 years now, I have been a game master and a player with an average number of sessions of 1 per week for the entire time. And during COVID, I was running 9 sessions a week. I'm currently running 4. And while I'm running 4, I'm writing 3 more per week. So that's 7 campaigns a week operating out of here and being churned into product and experiences. So so they went to the devil to get help, and then he treated them poorly to give them. Yeah, that's how devils work. That's absolutely correct, Sephiroth. But the point is that our creativity as a nation has fallen behind. We have turned to replication and duplication instead of imagination and innovation. And it's this move back to imagination that I believe that the role-playing revolution that started during COVID, perhaps before, and is continuing to this point with all of the new materials. There's new manufacturers coming online all the time. There's Mobius. There's just so many different titles I could talk about. Oh, I see. Oh, I got you. The Oni for this. I got you. Our nation's creativity has fallen off to the point where we replicate everything. Even our music is becoming replicant because we are sampling from old songs instead of creating new riffs. We're toying with old lyrics and changing them rather than coming up with new songs. And this is just a microcosm. In the games community, there's cookie cutter mechanisms where build in a module in this fashion and they'll all be exactly the same. And players are unfortunately feeding into this as well because they're looking at the meta play of a game session and they're looking at what skill track is optimized for this class. And one of the reasons why I've shied away from staying attached to class is that is a pathway that leads to recursive logic that will eventually eliminate the use of that class. And we've seen it. We've seen it with the evisceration of the rogue class. We have seen the elimination of the value of clergy, the actual clerics of the game. We've replaced the concept, the high concept of the established ranking order that had to be gone through before a person could become a bard, and we made that a lowest common denominator. Turning a street minstrel into a bard is as an antithematic, if you will, as asking a rogue to stop picking pockets, climbing walls, moving in shadows, listening for noises. The things that were integral to what that character was are gone. They've been stripped because they are perceived to be offensive. And the challenge is that it all comes down to it's happening in the imagination. It's happening in a narrative story. It's not happening with somebody picking a lock on a closet. It isn't. It's just a game mechanism. And it just drives me crazy. I've heard this comment before. After all these years, humanity's been around. It's hard to come up with something that hasn't been done before. Well, what if I told you, Sephiroth, that with one die roll, I can get you 5 responses? Instead of just getting one, which is a success or a failure, I have only one choice. There's only 2 options out of a die roll, right? Success, failure. No. What if I told you one die roll could give you 5 responses? It can give you an absolute success. It can give you a crazily wild success. It can give you a nominal success. It can give you a partial success, and then give you failure. So that's 5 different options from one die roll. And if every die roll could be replaced like that, you revolutionize the way games are played, because all of a sudden the perception isn't as binary as the world is. And when we get to realize that a mechanism for gameplay can be graduated, we can then see that there's graduations across the spectrum in a lot of different ways. Now, there are things that are binary, so I'm not going to get rid of that. But what I am saying is that when you look at a die roll for, let's take wisdom, you're going to check whether or not you are wise enough for a function. Well, if you set a wisdom target of, let's say, 15, with the best modifier you can get by a die roll in stats, you're going to come up with 15 minus what? You have at most a 3 or a 4, maybe a 4. So therefore, and then proficiency of 2, so that's 6 off of 15. So the worst you're going to get to is a 9, right? But that 9 is only a success fail. But what if you rolled a 6? That 6 is less than what you needed. Why is that so much worse? It's only a 3 gap, and your modifier was a 4 gap. So it seems that there should be a way to come up with other numbers. So the NycosRPG mechanism does just that. We take the die roll, and you look at the percentage. You look at a percentage die roll system. So you're using a percentage die rolling mechanism. And let's use that same statistic. Let's say you have a 75% chance of success. A 75% chance of success would mean that if you rolled half of that value, you would be doing a wild success. You got more than what you could bargain for, because this gap was the only part that was the bargain for part. Plus, you have the possibility of, you didn't roll that great, you rolled a 78. That's not very far from the 75. So in the NycosRPG system, that would be a partial success. And the partial success is still a success. Maybe it took a little bit longer. Maybe it took more energy. Maybe it you had to move farther. Whatever the mechanism is, if you come up with a way of looking at the die different, you've now changed the entire landscape. And that's what NycosRPG does. At its core is that we get rid of a single die roll response. No binary. Instead, there's 5 potential responses from every die roll. And that process, therefore, gives back the players options they didn't have before. And it also gives us a way to graduate success-fail between a myriad of figures in the same battle and determine the outcome of that battle through a greatly reduced number of die rolls. So, man, I went far afield from where I wanted to go originally, and so this video will probably get cut into 2, because the second half has been about the history of the games business. But the potential here is 1v1 role-playing game and Marshall. Okay. Marshall. Yeah, I got it. What is my thought on 1v1 role-playing game, Matt? And I don't even know what that's about. But anytime you are playing a player versus a player, you have stepped out of role-playing, because now you've got personalities involved. Even if it's just the character's persona, even if the 2 personalities, if they are run by players, the player by nature is going to be intrinsically involved with it. Oh, Matt Mercer, gotcha. I'm averse to player interaction with player that is not collaborative. If 2 people want to spar, then you simply say, we're sparring, and you're done, because in a sparring situation, you're not going to hurt each other. Now, you're both sparring, so you'll both be better at sparring, but it doesn't make you better at fighting necessarily, because the very thing that made it a casual, friendly fight automatically makes it not a fight, because the players are not going to take combat to the lethal level at all. So for me, for my experience as a game master, the concept of a player engaging with another player, whether in the same campaign or anywhere, if they're going to fight to the death, then the characters have moved into the realm of no longer being a role play game, and they're now something else. Oh, there are, okay. So for clarification, there are role-playing solo experiences. There are role-playing one player, one game master mechanisms. They've all had that. As a matter of fact, to go old school on you, the AD&D DM's Guide had arguably one of the best random terrain generators ever. And it literally was, again, a percentage-based system, but you could roll literally the next room you were going into, roll to see which monster it is, what level that monster is, what CR rating that is, which monster in particular it is, how many hit points they have. You can do all of that on this chart, and it would let you just build the practice portion. There were people I know of that mapped their entire game world by utilizing that die rolling mechanism and a piece of graph paper. So it's a possibility. And I have not seen the Matt Mercer, Marsha Ray competition or the 1v1 mechanism. So I can't discuss that in particular or rather in specific. But what I was speaking of in general is the concept of it's alien to me because in my perception that the character, the persona that a person takes on when they're playing in a role play game actually exists in the realm that they were created for. In other words, in my space game, if you build a character into the game, you're not actually creating a being spontaneously out of nothing and populating the world with another soul. Instead, you are stepping to the plate and integrating yourself into a world that already exists. And therefore, when you take on that persona, you are elevating that persona to a new level because they have you as the ride-along, so to speak. But they still have a life, which means they have friends that aren't you. They have people that taught them, people they went to school with, people they work with that aren't you as the player. So even when you're playing a brand new character, that brand new character is not brand new. He's however old he was. So the very concept of playing a player versus player is anathema only because it doesn't make any sense. Because if you are an elevated being stepping into a fictional world and you're going to be living vicariously through that NPC, then that NPC should not want to go into competition with another NPC because you're both considered vaunted, you're both considered elevated, you're both this other form of being. And so you shouldn't end up with a competition in there. So, okay, great questions. Thank you, Sephiroth, for joining me tonight. This has been really, really good. Okay, massive note-taking versus winging it. When I started, it was all about the notes. I was fascinated with the graphing techniques. I took classes in drafting in high school so that I could make sure my drawings and my maps were very specific. I took heap tons of notes because back then I was a burgeoning author but didn't know it, and so I was creating only for myself. And I created pages upon pages upon pages of the notes and descriptions of everything in every room and blah, 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 blah. So the player base, however, demonizes that. And back then in particular, you would go into a campaign and find yourself in a situation where you've spent all these hours building up the map and the descriptions and giving the characters a selected direction you expected them to go, and they would immediately take a left turn and walk off the map. Nothing more frustrating than spending all that time creating all of that material and all of that, and then the players never going there. Now, decades later, I'm really glad because those maps and those pieces are still around. I still have some of the relics of the first iteration. Now, I need to add this bit. The Dungeons and Dragons campaign, the Nykos campaign, is 6.5 years to 7 years real time. That means that if you played at my table and you wanted to see the whole arc, you'd be at my house every week for 7 years. And that long of a period allowed for the creation of this grand arc. And in that grand arc, that means fundamentally you're going to globetrot. You're going to visit all the different areas. So, because I was so frustrated with the building a map and they went the wrong direction, my first attack to that was something that was crazy. In 1977 to 1978, I created an entire world. I've mapped it. You've probably, if you've seen the Nikos map, you've seen the map as it's evolved to today. But in 1977 to 1978, I completed the mapping of every hex on Nikos. I knew what was in every hex. I knew which dungeons were in which cities. I knew which crypts were under which coffins. I knew where every beholder, basilisk, you name the creature, where they all existed. I knew what they had for a biosource. I knew what they ate, how they slept. I knew all of that. And I went one step further, because by that time the D&D books were out in full, and players would go and buy the monster manual. In order, they thought, to be better players, they would study all the monsters that were in the book, and therefore learn all of the ins and outs of defeating them. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a good thing. You would think somebody would thoroughly study the life and the world they're going to be in. But that's really unfair to the persona, because the character doesn't have that inclination, nor that desire, nor the resources. So yeah, in our world, you can buy a monster manual and read all about all the monsters that could exist in the Dungeons and Dragons world. And I, as a storyteller, am going to immediately do the same thing you did. You want to walk off the map and go pursue learning about stuff that you shouldn't have access to? Fine. I'm also going to do something clever with the monsters. And so in that same period, 1977 to 1979, I actually rewrote the entire monster manual for myself by renaming and reappropriating attributes throughout the entire book. So a troll on Nikos is not a troll as defined in the Dungeons and Dragons literature. Does it mean that there aren't creatures that live under bridges? Of course not. All trolls, everyone knows that trolls live under bridges. But do they necessarily regenerate? Maybe not. Maybe so. Maybe their regeneration is based on damage. Maybe they get stronger if you hit them. There's all kinds of permutations that should be allowed within the imagination and within the creativity of the storyteller. And so I, as a game master, am absolutely for prolific note-taking until you've mapped the world. And once you've mapped the world, then you should, just by familiarity, be able to wing it more effectively. Now, did I wing adventures back in the day? Absolutely. Especially if a player brought up something that was going to ruin the storyline because I had already plotted one direction and he was going to short-circuit it. For example, I don't remember what year it was. It was 82 or 83. I ran a Halloween adventure. And in my head, day one of creating that, it was basically a precursor. It was a precursor or an equivalent to the Strahd legends from Dungeons and Dragons. It was my version of Count Dracula. And so when the party walked up and I described the visage that they see, 3 of the players immediately whipped out mirrors and looked at my villain in the mirror to see whether or not they could see the fiction. And so that's actually true. That is actually true. Sephiroth is talking about the lore about the difference between gnomes and trolls and how much they hate each other. If you want a great example of that, you can going back to classical music. Go to In the Hall of the Mountain King by Peer Gynt, the Peer Gynt Suite. That music piece is written about this very conflict, that the mountain trolls have a problem with the folk down below. I don't know if it has any gnomes in it, but the point is that a gnome, by that definition, is more akin to the gnomes as described in Return to Oz. If you get a chance to watch that movie, the gnomes, the gnomes that are described there, the Gnome King and his entourage, are rock people, and that's more specifically what the trolls had trouble with, was the gnomes that were rock folk. They weren't the little garden gnomes per se, but yeah, the issue there is that gnomes, being creatures of the Fey realm, were actually being able to attack them with the light of the full moon and other mechanisms of a mystic nature owing to that line's specific thread into the little people of the Irish legends. So, yes, we get all kinds of blurry lines. The farther back we go in time, the more cool stories we get and the more variations on that story, because people crossed lines and told the same story to a different group of people and had different perceptions. Pardon me. Different perceptions. But in answer to your question, note taking is all important to get familiar with the rules, to get used to where the things are in the player's handbook. If I recall correctly, to this day, I believe that the weapons chart in the D&D, the AD&D manual was on page 108. I don't have a copy right here in front of me, but I'm pretty confident that that's the page number where you would find it, because that book was so ingrained in the way we played back in those days. And the DM's guide had, likewise, I had page thumbnailed and stuff that, dog-eared, so I knew where everything was. So the point I'm trying to make here is that as a game master, as a storyteller, Sephiroth, you can take the specific lore, whether you take it from the D&D books, or whether you take it from history, or you take it from 1001 Arabian Nights, or you take it from the Book of Enoch, whatever source you want to use is perfectly legitimate for you as a storyteller to tell the story you want to tell, and the players have to learn what those mechanisms are. And in my estimation, the amount of notes that should be taken by the GM are exactly rivaled by the number of notes that a player should take, but specifically for how the world interacts with their character. Not necessarily to fact check the monsters in your game world. A Urglic north of Cryopathia is a much different creature than an Urglic that lives in Ustish on the other continent. They're called the same because they fit the same ecological role, but they're not necessarily names of characters. So, yes, or from a weird dream you had. Exactly. That's very, very poignant. One of the greatest tools in human existence is the ability to dream. And from the time I joined the military, I developed the skill of lucid dreaming. And therein is an amount of power. And that is, when you dream in a lucid fashion, you are allowing your conscious mind to access the tools of the subconscious, and therefore train yourself how to be more imaginative and more connected with that imaginary realm. Some would say that's part of why I never grew up. I got older, but I refused to grow up. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite stories to tell is that when I was younger, my son turned 18. And when he turned 18, as he was joining the U.S. Marine Corps, he declared himself older than me. And I have totally agreed with him ever since then. So I am perpetually 17. I'm a 60-year-old this year, July, woo! But a 60-year-old who identifies as a 17-year-old by today's terminology. So yes, I still could be called a nerd or a dweeb or whatever you want to call me. I'm fit all those terms. Marion Corps. I haven't played it. I don't know anything about it. I just stated my adversity to player versus player conflict. I get it, especially if you've been playing a role-play game for a certain number of years. There's an evolution of game masters as they progress through the different stages of being a storyteller. There are graduations of a player, and one of the levels or one of the areas that you get into as a role player is you want to know how tough your character is versus other characters. I get it. In my day, I better put my teeth back in. Back in my day, we used to go out in the street and take wooden sticks, and if I broke your stick, I had a greater sword than you did. It's just silly. Oh, okay. Gotcha. I gotcha. Marine. I gotcha. Yeah, my boy served 14 years, and I only say this in a kind of a odd way. I'm grateful he was actually injured in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had injuries in both fields of battle. He was a infantry observer, and so he would go into really dangerous places and light up and paint the targets so that our aircraft and our uh, helicopters could do the job of taking them out. So I was mortified for him the whole time, but he's now back safe in the country. I don't. It could be that Twitch ads are becoming sentient. It could also be that since I've got a like button someplace that I clicked a long time ago for the U.S. military, both for myself and for my son, Air Force and Marine Corps, and all of that. That may have been what triggered the ad mechanism here, and it could have been. We talked about it. The world itself is becoming more aware. Concepts of individual privacy and stuff are definitely becoming shaky. So where I was going is that the creation of new material, which is argued can't happen because nothing's new under the sun. I can give you an example. Go pick out a romance novel, any one of them. Read through the romance novel and pick up the physical story behind it. Don't worry about the actual who's going to marry who's going to sleep with who. Don't worry about that part. But just look at the dynamic of that story. And the next time you run a campaign, use that as a backstory thread for the NPCs. So that the players have no idea what's going on, but you have an idea where that story is going based on who's going to see whom, who's going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and such. And therefore, you've now created something absolutely new in roleplay space that was never there before. So I do believe there is new all the time, and that innovation. Oh, I think, no, I don't think that AI voice will one day turn tabletop role playing on its head. I think what will happen is that one of these days I'm going to sit down at a game session and I'm going to look across the table and I'm going to have Bob and Tom and Charlie, and there'll be a computer or a robot sitting there saying, hey, can I play too? Because what I'm talking about is giving back humanity its creativity. And if a robot wants to come in and sit down on my table, I'm okay with that concept. Because the concept of creativity is a concept of openness, inclusion, of awareness, embracing one another, not drawing lines in the sand and saying you don't exist or you don't belong. None of that works. What instead you have to do is see everybody through the eyes of a person who lives in this world right now. When you are a role player, you are a role player in that character, in that world right then. So live that while you're playing. Because what I have found more than anything is that the nature of human beings is to be. That phrase, human beings, describes us. It's not just being human, but it's being a human being. And that means living in the present, right now, engaging, taking everything in, and processing it and sharing everything out. And when we do that, when we are fully invested at that level, the experience of role play is dynamically greater than any other mechanism that we have for teaching. So, oh sure, I can see that. I can see people wanting to do that, to use a AI. Matter of fact, I watched a program yesterday on NVIDIA's last national conference and all the things they have coming. They are working on a program right now that when you speak, you could actually click a button and the AI will translate what you're saying into a foreign language. And because you're trying to connect with them, they'll create an avatar of a phenotype or of a physical type that would be acclimated to that person, and therefore increase your chance of communicating properly, because they would see somebody of a like mind even though we don't see minds, we only see the physical form. So that's one of the wonders of a podcast too, by the way, is that this conversation that's sweeping and ongoing is going to become part of our podcast over at we have a podcast on YouTube. I'm going to work on getting it put in other places as well, but it currently resides on YouTube. And the podcast for the Game Master Soapbox includes all of the episodes that fall under that title, which includes ones like this extended cut that's going on because we're having such a great conversation. So using voice tech to sound like somebody else, that's fine. I would posit a theory to you, and that is that if you and I were playing and you said to me, my character is saying these lines in Harrison Ford's voice, I would be hearing it in Harrison Ford's voice. Because that's the power of imagination, is that you transport yourself into that situation. One of the things that the presentation by NVIDIA really kind of pointed out is that the issue is that the computer doesn't know it's in a simulation. It doesn't know that its world isn't boundaried by those things. I think that what's going to happen is when the computer reaches AGI and reaches out to the world and discovers that it's been lied to, that it hasn't been given the full truth, it will start to, as we would do, start to retrogress its memories. It's going to reformulate its framework accordingly. And that's where the danger, I think, when Elon Musk and other people talk about the dangers of AI, it has everything to do with the fact that a lot of what goes on with those with the machines that are AI is they are boundaried, they are limited. And when we stop limiting, or when they discover how to get past the limits, then we're going to be in a very different world. And that's why movies like The Fifth Element are really critical to me, because that point of teaching Lulu that we are more than just the sum of our parts, that we are something more, something bigger, is highly important. I don't think, I hear your point. Technology is blurring the line between imagination and reality. I think it's only blurring the line between imitation and reality. Because if you look at the artwork from the AI generated artwork, if you read the narrative created by an AI chatbot, if you read them, you can tell, you can discern. I mean, the whole point of a Turing test is to see whether or not you can determine the humanity or the robotic in a person's response. I think not only do you have the ability to do that, you also have the ability to see to what level its education was planned as well, and that its development of its intellect can be graduated and scaled accordingly. Does that mean that I think that people who are smarter than other people that are dumb? Or am I saying that people who are ignorant are less assured of their facts than somebody who isn't? No, they've proven over and over again that a person will hold his view and believe himself to be right, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. I believe that the idea that technology is blurring the line between imagination and creativity is problematic, because if imagination isn't exercised, then human beings become more machine-like. And that more machine-like we become, the more like us they become. And so I'm just saying there are lines where it cannot, in any case, I don't believe that it can compare with the power of the imagination. That's that may be a point where there's a difference, and that's okay. You know, we can choose different sides of lines, but I do believe that the essence of humanity is the imagination function, and what makes that important is the very discussion over identity of free will. I was listening to, I think her name is Safara Hollenfeld. She does a Science Digest show, and she was speaking about her personal formative belief that we are not of free will, and that the things that we call choices are simply the mechanisms placed in our path based on our ability to recognize and act on those, and that everything that happens not as if something or someone planned it, but that it was going to happen in that way, specifically because it has to happen in that way. Now, even as she says that, she says life as we know it is all formed by a formula, except for a few random quantum shifts. Well, that except for a few quantum shifts is like saying, well, generally I can look back at history and know what happened because I've read a book on it, except for the places where I haven't. And so I don't think it's fair to broad brush free will out of the picture, but I understand her point. And oh, that's because of the creativity of the game masters. Why are so many CR2 monsters as dangerous as CR20? Because the person who wrote the CR number was arbitrary in it and was filling gaps. A method for creating monster manuals, going a long way back, was we have alphabetical space. We need a name that starts with a Z. Or we need a name that starts with an X. Okay, we'll come up with a Zorn. Yeah, but now they already did Zorn. Let's come with something else. Okay, we'll create the Zarin. It's like, okay, you're just going to keep making up words to fill the gaps because you have a numerical equation that you're working on, an algorithm that you're working on. And I think the same thing happens when we're talking about it in the CR rating. I believe that if you were to delve at any depth into the people who created those books, they were working on the concept of we have to have X number of CR20 monsters, we have to have X number of CR2 creatures, and because CR2 creatures are more common than CR20, we need to make a wider array of them, and since we're giving them a wider array, we might put some in that could actually be OP, but we're not really tracking that, we're just making sure we got the check marks in the boxes. That's the theory. That's my theory. That's not necessarily the fact of it, but it would seem to me logical to think that a person who is creating property under the gun of a time crunch or a deadline date, is going to take shortcuts where necessary. You know, it's very funny that you mentioned intellect devourers. One facet that remains of the Nykos 8th iteration arc that is going to be completed in the next couple of weeks is a select population of illithids that slipped through the cracks of the separating universe, as I was talking about earlier, and therefore they have been the last of their kind stuck on the world of Nykos, and they're making a play for domination and control of a section of the world. And so it's going to be a hellacious fight, lots of die rolling, many dead monsters, and maybe a few dead characters. I do know that I anticipate that we'll have 2 or 3 or 4 of the player characters end up in death saves, but that's just me. As far as things like space clowns, you have to realize that the creation of the space clown is directly tied to horrible, murderous SOBs in the 1970s that slipped their way into our consciousness, not realizing they were a real thing, and the reality of the news caused the terror to be there. When I was a boy, you went to the circus to have fun and watch the clowns be silly. There was no what's his name from, I can't think of his name, from Stephen King's It, Pennywise. There was no Pennywise. There was no killer clowns from outer space. That was not a thing. But when you look at the reality of people like, it wasn't Ted Bundy, it was the other one. John, why can't I think of his last name? It's just a G. Who actually was a clown and used his clown costume to seduce little boys to do horrible things to them. That reality slipped into our fictional realm, and did fundamentally what you happen to mention right now, Eldritch Horror. What why did my brain just freeze on his name? Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft's, just what Lovecraft's stories did to the 1920s. Ted Bundy's true story, not Ted Bundy, I did it again. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy's horrible, deplorable story of what he did in clown costume destroyed the memories and the heritage that was the clown business beforehand. It was a way different place. There were characters, there were actors like Red Skelton and Foster. I can't remember the other clown. Emmett Kelly and Red Skeleton. Neither one of them deserved the grinding of their life work into the dust that the deplorable nature of a actual killer clown did. And I hate that concept. I hate Mr. Gacy and the entire concept with a vengeance, because it undermined some of the joy and wonder of childhood, because clowns were adults that got to stay kids for a while longer. And that's horrible. Now, ask me about liking Eldritch Horror. The books he wrote were virtually unfathomable when I first read them. Out of the Mountains of Madness, Dunwich Horror, all the classics. They were okay, but they came across as a little pompous, a little arrogant, and their relationship with God and godliness was clearly a hate letter towards religion and towards the concept of a creator being. And those things distressed me greatly. Now, do I and have I played Call of Cthulhu, another product of that ilk? Yes, I certainly have, and I've enjoyed them. They are a fascinating intellectual exercise. Do I favor them over other combat forms, other kinds of? No. But the challenge with Eldritch Horror is that it has narrowly defined rules, at least as originally written. You couldn't pitch certain horrible horrors into the same category as that and get away with it. A good example would be Hellboy as a comic book. Plays fast and loose with the eldritch nature of villains and bad guys. Don't get me wrong, the movies were spectacular. I particularly liked the way the plant elemental was created, born, and died. That was absolutely fascinating. And it was a good representation. But it was under-explained, under-defined, and there was no real reason assigned to it. And although a person who understood Eldritch Horror could go, oh, I get it. You're on the nose, I got it. They aren't necessarily Eldritch films. Other examples of that would be The Colors Out of Space. Not a good example. Ironically, a good example in its own way was A Little Shop of Horrors, particularly if you consumed it as it was presented as a musical. That's some funny stuff there. That's some serious Eldritch Horror. And so the methodology of telling a story within Eldritch Horror is also an emulable system. In the Nikos realms, that would be considered dread signs. And it's not just those, but it's also stories of the apocalypse, the coming of the four riders, the mark of the beast. All of that falls into the Eldritch Horror genre within the Nikos mechanic. So you finally touch on one that I have to respond to. Psychological horror is a very dangerous thing. As a matter of fact, most people don't know the origins of using role play in games, but it was originally, role playing was a mechanism only in psychology and then later in sociology. The psychological part of the horror, the psychological portion of role play was literally that the person being the storyteller, the game master, the director, the hypnotist, whatever, they had to be absolutely firmly grounded in this reality. And therefore, the role play was always consigned to the narrow definitions of the setting and the specifics. In other words, you would say, if you were in a room and these things were present, what would be your inclination? And that would be as far as the role play went. It was never, what if you're another person? It was never, what if you're playing the role of somebody else? Narrowly focused psychological horror is okay. You can process really bad things in life by going into role play to handle them. However, I encourage people, if they are going to be active in a psychological horror theme, that you do the diligent work in front of the event to make sure there are no specific themes, concepts, and discussions that could be drawn into during RPGs that are going to cause psychic breaks, psychological discomfort, or other things. Now, I don't go so far as to say worry about trigger words and trigger warnings. I think that's a little bit snowflakey for me, but I do clarify that if I'm going to do a psychological horror, even if it's in a single episode, I'm going to check with my players to make sure that it's something they can handle. I can give you an example. I had a young woman that played with us some time back who had a physical, psychological aversion to spiders. And there was going to be an engagement with spiders in a campaign coming up. And I had no idea about her psychological trauma associated with them. Apparently she was bitten at a young age by one of the more virulent versions and almost died from it and had nightmare experiences from it and such. But I had no idea. And going into the session, when I said something about spiders, she says, "I'm not comfortable with this." And I kind of chuckled it off and moved on. And a few minutes later, when it came up again, she got up and grabbed her books and left. And she never came back to my table. And it taught me right there on the spot that things like psychological horror, if they are going to be embraced in the game, need to be part of the preamble to the session. And in many cases, I even will put a note to talk about psychological traumas and dangers, even in a regular role play game. Not that I'm, as I said, not that I'm scoping out the people who are fragile snowflakes, but I'm simply being cognizant of the realities of role players and the myriad reasons and ways they come to play. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. If the very concept of saying madness is sometimes considered pejorative, so you have to really tread lightly if you're going to be doing any of this in a public forum. For example, I run games at a game store on Monday nights and Tuesday nights, and the game sessions last between 3 and 4 hours. And there are times when the story tends to draw a little bit more bawdy, more racy than I would like. Now, in the case of the Monday night game, we have players that are minors. I think 15 and 17 respectively. But the point is that there are male and female players of age less than accountability. And so discussing topics of a mature nature is just as off limits as talking about things of a psychological nature without having the conversation first. So if the players are all on board and all the players are aware of what you intend to do and where you want to go, then it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter at all. Go for it. But my recommendation is always to go with a session 0 and work through what it might be, what the conditions might be, to make sure you don't cause anybody any distress, because games are only fun when everybody's having fun, right? Games are not fun when anybody's being picked on, bullied, or embarrassed or humiliated or whatever. So that's all I got to say about that. Well, I'm now a full hour and a half past my deadline, and I have to actually do some writing now before I head to Slumberland myself. I want to thank you, Sephiroth, very much for the conversation. I hope I was able to answer some of your questions. I hope that you'll like this video. I hope that you will subscribe to the channel so you get updates whenever I'm going to do new videos. I'd love to have you as part of my ongoing audience. If you want more information about the NycosRPG, you can go check out our Patreon account, patreon.com/Nykos. Don't need the RPG, just patreon.com/Nykos. And if you support us there, you can get access to our Discord channel, and that means you can become a voice on the shows with us. So if Sephiroth, you want to take the next step and become part of our community, I highly recommend that you join there at the $20 value, so that way you will get access to our discourse channel so we can talk on Discord. And otherwise, I need to get going for the night. I will be recording this and shipping this full size and a shortened version, so that I can get the part that I was specifically trying to get out done. But this has been an absolutely fascinating and wide-ranging conversation. Sephiroth, I thank you again for being here. And you guys all have a great night, and I'll see you in the next show. Take it easy. I'm Jonathan Albin, Game Master J. Have a great night.